All right, so do we understand what all of these things are? Okay.
Okay, no. The Jim Crow laws, all that blood stuff.
Okay, so Jim Crow laws, yes, and if you're not 100% sure, you need to make sure you write it down. Jim Crow laws establish segregation. That is what? Political, economic, or social?
Social.
That is social. Okay? Literacy tests and poll taxes are about what? Keeping black people from voting. Please make sure you understand this. I feel like I preach it every year. Literacy tests are not about literacy, and poll taxes are not about taxes. They are both methods used in the South to keep black people from voting. I have long argued that a legitimate literacy test should probably be used for everybody voting. Because it only takes standing in line with people voting one time to figure out if people are what they're doing. Right? They don't know anything. But it would never be fair because literacy tests are always what? Written by somebody from some point of view, right? So there's no way to create one that's legitimate, right? There's no way to create one that's impartial. These literacy tests were typically constitutional interpretation questions, like DBQs for y'all. Yes. Okay, that's typically what these were. They were not as objective as like a citizenship test. I've often said like the citizenship test should be given to everybody. Like when you turn 18, you should have to pass the citizenship test before you can vote. If immigrants have to pass a citizenship test, shouldn't citizens be able to pass a citizenship test? Except they couldn't. Okay. Those are typically more objective, like who are your senators for your state? Who are the representatives for your state? How many people are in the electoral college? Right? Stuff about how our government works. Okay. All right. So, if we look at these things, right, we know this is what happens. What does this? So these are political, right? These are social and cultural, right? And you have to understand, I don't know what y'all know about Jim Crow laws, but we're going to talk about it in the next unit too. They are extensive. This is not like a law that says things have to be segregated. These are very specific laws, down to you cannot operate a white baseball field within 2 blocks of a black baseball field. White students may not use textbooks ever used by black students.
That's not the dumbest thing.
Black people and white people may not play together at a game of billiards. Okay? They are very, very specific. Because what were rich white people, okay, Southern white Democrats, the rich ones who control things over here, what are they more afraid of than anything? Why do they pass these laws? To stop poor white people from figuring out they have something in common with poor black people. Because if you put poor white people and poor black people together in the South, you got 80% of the people. Okay? So if they ever figure out they have something in common, these people might be in trouble. So what do? Rich white people convince poor white people they are better than black people. And as long as the rich white people are in charge, that's how it'll stay. You'll also stay poor, but you won't be black. Okay? I mean, essentially that's what it is. It's not that complicated. It's sad that people are not as black. Okay? All right, but what does this not answer? That I told you is going to be at the root of the failure of this is already pretty bad. But why can't blacks do anything about this? Why can't they do anything to better themselves? Why can't they get the education so they know what's happening so they can fight it? Why do they believe it?
Because that's all they know.
How do you keep them there?
Bias.
What I tell you is a big failure. This explains political failure. This explains social and cultural failure. But what's at the root of it? The economic failure. And here's where I really don't like Paget. Here's where I'm really mad at Paget. Because I was like, surely Paget goes into some explanation of what sharecropping was and how sharecropping impacted the development of the South for 100 years. I think there's a sentence in Paget on sharecropping. He should be ashamed of himself. And Bailey and Cohen with him for writing that book 16 times and not fixing it. Okay? So that's like in 16th edition now or something. They still haven't fixed it. So we're going to focus a little bit more today on the sharecropping system and why it's so important to understand. Do not start writing this down. Do not just start copying it. I will not make any sense. Can you tell I made this? It looks like my brain. It looks like my brain. This is how my brain works. Right? This is what it looks like inside there. I'll never say everything looks like.
This is the only class where I started writing it. I started like really big outlines. It's like very.
7 years. And I do. For those of you who are like concrete, like sequential people who want things in lines, I'm sorry, my brain just does not work that way. My house doesn't even work that way, like I wouldn't even pick a house plan to have like a straight hole, I got like a circle in there too, okay? Alright, so, well, it is, that's how you're like, it's just, anyway. So, this is how sharecropping works, alright, now.
Griffin, Arkansas.
It's so scary in there too. I made it put a door where there wasn't one, I'm like, it has to be a circle, like, how can it go all the way around? They're like, okay, so there's this door from my laundry room to my bedroom, otherwise I have to walk around the house to get to the other door, I don't know. Now I wish that door wasn't there.
You're in the wrong
Get out of the
job.
house. I went through the laundry room to my room to get outside.
They didn't build your house. Come on.
Huh?
Jet legs.
I built my house.
Oh.
No, I didn't build it, but I was the contractor.
Really?
Yeah, you can get that for your own house. Yeah. It was not
I
fun.
can see you with a hammer and a nail.
No, I didn't. I said I was a contractor. Contractors don't actually work.
Oh,
Contractors do work.
different set. I'm not gonna work.
Contractors hire people to work. All right, but they had to do what I said.
Oh, I bet you enjoyed it.
So, yeah, that was fun. All right, so let's talk about sharecropping. Before we write down any of this, because if you just start copying this down, it won't make a whole lot of sense. Let's talk about what the economic situation was in the South that explains where this diagram comes from. So tell me about the economic condition in the South. First of all, tell me about former slaves, economically. They have no money, no education, no, they're no longer slaves, they've been
They
freed.
don't have,
No job, no land, no home,
they just poor.
right? What do they have? What skill do they have? Farming. They know how to work. And that is a huge difference. They can stay together as families, okay? So they know farming, and they have their family. Okay? This is the lack of economic change right here, okay? Tell me about the planters, the plantation owners.
They have land.
They have no money. They have land.
They have nobody to work there.
They have no workers. Okay? All right? So what happens?
They work together.
They
That makes sense.
hire
They're
them.
still like a commune.
They hire
They're
them.
not in like a commune. They're not.
They
like
give them
a kumbaya.
land just to live on, and they pay them just,
Nobody has any money.
well,
Nobody has any money.
I know they give them land and something.
Okay, so these people have land. They do what?
Give some to the former slaves.
They give a piece of land to these people. Not really give it. They let these people live on a piece of land. And these people do what? They farm it with their whole family, and then they give what they produce to the person who owns the land. It's a no money situation to start with, right? Because nobody really has any. Interestingly enough, and here's where things get interesting for how it affects the South for the next 100 years after this, because sharecropping is like the situation with voting and Jim Crow laws. They don't go away when Reconstruction's over, it gets worse. Okay? It gets worse when Reconstruction's over. This description right here doesn't really apply to just former slaves after the Civil War. It also applies to poor white people. Poor, landless white people. Who were a lot of people in the South, because if you'd had some small farm and then you got drafted to go fight, what probably happened to your farm while you were gone?
Confiscated.
It was destroyed, or it was confiscated by the bank because something couldn't be paid on it, or it was taken over by somebody else. So there's a lot of poor whites in the South, and a lot of former slaves, 4 million or so, and a few planters who own a lot of land because nothing was confiscated. Remember, nobody would go with Thaddeus Stevens. Nobody would go down that road with Thaddeus Stevens to confiscate property and redistribute it. So this is where we are in the South, right? So this situation is what lends itself to this contract. So this diagram starts here, okay? I can cut lights out. The stars are kind of small. I'll tell you what's in the stars. Okay? All right? Does that help? Not really, it's just small. And they're a little fuzzy. I'm not sure why they're fuzzy. So here's what happens in the contract. It's exactly what you guys just described, okay? The landowner, the plantation owner, is going to offer former slaves and poor whites a contract that basically says you can live on my plantation. While you're living here, you will do all the labor. So you will plant the crops, tend the crops, harvest the crops. And when the crops are sold, you will give me 2/3 of the profit from it. So the landowner keeps 2/3 of what's produced, the sharecropper gets 1/3. Okay, that's the typical contract. That can be negotiated, okay? I'll fill this in as we go through the day with stories of my family's history. My mother was one of 10 children, and her family, back as far as they could count and remember generations, were sharecroppers. So my mom was born in 1948. Her parents had been sharecroppers, she knows. Their parents had been sharecroppers, and her great-grandparents, she knows, were sharecroppers. Further back than that, they don't have any records or anything to really know, but probably, based on this, went further back than that. And so, most of the time, their contracts were thirds. She said occasionally you would be able to work out a contract that was halves, and that was a much better deal. You could keep half of what you produced. So, but typically it was thirds. Sharecropper kept a third, landowner kept 2/3. Now, this doesn't actually, when you just look at this part, this doesn't actually seem unreasonable, right? If I own the land, and you got to have land to produce something, there might be some logic in the thirds thing, okay? The problem comes in with what happens during the course of the year. First of all, I want you guys, I'm going to cut the light on for a second. To kind of have a vision in your head of how this actually worked in the South, let's say that this represents a large plantation. Okay? And a large plantation before the Civil War would have had, like, the big house, right? The house that the owner of the land lived in. 2 stories, probably, nice, whatever.
Big house.
Got a nice driveway.
It was
Right?
marvelous.
Thank you. My artistic ability astounds. And then during the Civil War, before the Civil War, 200 years of slavery, probably had slave quarters and then a whole bunch of fields, right?
Reminds me of the Django.
Right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right, that makes sense?
That was a good movie.
After the Civil War, you're no longer going to have slave quarters because freedom also basically means that slaves can have families. So what happens in this era is that the slave quarters are replaced by the building of sharecropper shacks, essentially, around the area that the person owned. And that way what? A sharecropper and their family would have a place to live, and rather than working like a whole plantation together, all the slaves work on the plantation, in sharecropping the contract would say, this family works this plot of land. This family works this plot of land, and so forth. Does that make sense?
Are they growing soybeans?
Okay, all right, would that make sense? What are they growing? You should know the answer to that. They're growing cotton. Okay, because people don't change unless they're forced to. So Southerners after the Civil War insist on going back and growing the same thing they were growing before the Civil War, only things about cotton changed dramatically after the Civil War. How did the Civil War change cotton in the world? Egypt's producing cotton. And India's producing cotton because the Civil War created a backlog of cotton from the American South that other people figured out you could profit from cotton. So the whole world's growing cotton. So what happens to cotton prices? They drop, and they keep dropping. And they drop throughout the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s, but people keep growing cotton because that's what they do and that's what they did. So that ultimately they're going to destroy the soil in many places because you can't keep growing cotton on land over and over again and not destroy it. And they're ultimately destroying their own economy. Anytime you have an economy based on one cash crop, that economy is going to be in trouble, right? If anything happens to that crop, you're in trouble. But that's what they do, right? Cotton is what we grow, we're going to keep growing cotton, okay? So, these farms are worked by these families, and 2/3 of the crop comes back here. Now, I don't think anybody in here are farmers. Anybody live in a family that's farmers? Okay, got somebody? Okay. How do farmers get paid?
My grandpa was a farmer, but he's not a farmer.
Not a farmer anymore. It's hard to be a farmer nowadays. It's why so many people don't do it. Well, how do farmers get paid?
They sell their crop
When?
at the end of the season.
Okay, so how do they get paid the rest of the year?
Or they lease it. Maybe you gotta save
They may
up.
lease the land and get paid that way, but if you're farming by yourself, what do you have to do from one year to the next? Like when you harvest and sell,
You gotta save, you gotta save.
you gotta save and plan it until the next harvest. Like I grew up in Falkland, Falkland even, smaller than Farmville. And so like the church there I grew up in, most of the tithing in that church came in November and December. Nobody tithed every month, people tithed every year. And once a year they paid their year's tithes when the harvest came in, because that's when you had money, right? So the sharecroppers don't have any money when they start the process. So during the course of the year, here's where our cycle starts to go around, right? So I made a couple of notes. First thing you have to recognize is that in this contract system, all of the books, all of the records are being kept by the landowner. Why? One very obvious reason.
So they can
So they don't get to choose any